Hello everybody. A warm welcome to all of you who have joined us here today in person or online on what is the first current legal problems lecture for this term. I am Denny Mander. I'm an associate professor in competition law and policy at the faculty and one of the editors of Current Legal Problems. And I have the privilege today of hosting here two exceptional women. Baroness Hale, who served as President of the UK Supreme Court from 2017 to her retirement in 2020, who's chairing our lecture here today, and Professor Erica Rackley, Professor in Law at the University of Kent. I shall say a few words about our chair this evening, and it's very, very difficult to summarize such a rich career and exceptional trajectory in a few words. I will just emphasize her first, Baroness Hale being the first female law lord, the first woman to serve on the UK Supreme Court, and the first to become its president. Thank you very much to both of you who are joining us here today. And without any further ado, I'll pass on the floor to Baroness Hale to introduce our speaker here tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a joy to be here. And I gather this is the first in-person CLP lecture for some considerable time, which makes it all the more enjoyable. Although this is no disrespect to the people who are watching online, who are equally welcome. It's my great delight to introduce Professor Erica Rackley to you. She's Professor of Law at the University of Kent, but she has previously been a professor in Durham and in Birmingham universities. She's got wide-ranging research interests, spanning law and gender, criminal law, torts, legal history, and judicial studies. And the latter is the focus of her lecture here this evening. She's written on judicial diversity and the nature of judging for over 2 decades, beginning in 2002 with a wonderful article called Representations of the Woman Judge, Hercules, the Little Mermaid, and the Vain and Naked Emperor. Now, isn't that a title that makes anybody want to read? But I rather gather that she's rethought a bit since then, so that'll be interesting to know. And her monograph, Women, Judging and the Judiciary, was published in 2012 and won the Society of Legal Scholars Peter Burke's Prize the following year, which is the top prize for an academic law book. So, brilliant achievement, Erica, well done. She's also shown a flattering interest in my own work as a judge. From an article called Difference in the House of Lords, published in Social and Legal Studies in 2006, to co-editing with Rosemary Hunter, whom we're delighted to see with us, Justice for All, which is a collection of essays exploring my legal lives and jurisprudence, which was published last year, to my deep embarrassment and delight, in roughly equal measures. And her scholarship has informed the debates and legislation of both the UK and Scottish governments. It's been widely cited by members of the judiciary, as well as in national and international media, including, she tells me, such varied sources as The Guardian, Women's Hour, and Law in Action. Yeah. So that's pretty good. And since 2014, she has co-led with Rosemary Ochmuty, also delighted to see you here, the Women's Legal Landmarks Project, which is an interdisciplinary collaboration involving feminist legal and history scholars, activists, lawyers and judges, identifying, researching and producing critical accounts of key legal landmarks, events, cases, statutes, and a few people as well are mentioned in it, I seem to remember, for women in the UK and in Ireland. And together they have written a number of articles on feminist legal history and biography, and a follow-up landmarks collection titled Not for the Want of Trying is focusing on the interwar years, which are really interesting in terms of what was and was not achieved during that time. So looking forward to that very much. But in the meantime, we're looking forward to your lecture. So here we go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brenda. So hello, and thank you to the CLP editors for inviting me to speak today. This lecture has been much delayed. It's almost 3 years since I got the original invitation to come and speak in March 2020, which was about 10 days before the first national lockdown. And the intervening years, I must
count like dog years because it feels like it's been much longer. And so I'm hugely grateful that the editors and board have kept the invitation open, and specifically to Sylvia Sutyu, Denny Manzari, Kat Balogun and Emma Blackman for their assistance in the preparation of this lecture. I'm delighted to be here in person and online, and so thank you for coming or tuning in whilst you're making dinner. Thank you too to Lady Hale for chairing my lecture today. As Denny noted, Lady Hale is without doubt the most outstanding and celebrated jurist and feminist of our time, and it goes without saying that she's extraordinarily busy, so I'm extremely grateful that she's able to be here today. Her busyness is matched only by her intellectual curiosity, impact and leadership, not least on judicial diversity, and remarkable generosity, and it's a generosity from which I've benefited now for over 2 decades, so thank you, Brenda. This lecture is drawn from a longer paper optimistically titled A Short History of Judicial Diversity, which itself is part of another project similarly titled but without the qualification of brevity. So it brings together my foundational work on the judiciary as well as my more recent collaborative work on feminist legal history. And so as a result, it's been the direct and indirect beneficiary of many conversations and the expertise of many colleagues over on unrelated and related themes, and so I thank them too. So, The Little Mermaid, written by Hans Christian Andersen, is the story of 6 sisters who live far out in the ocean with their father, the Sea King, and their grandmother. The grandmother is very wise and encourages her granddaughters to explore the wonder and beauty of the lands above the sea. As they each turn 15, the princesses visit these lands, returning to tell their sisters of what they saw. For most of the sisters, the novelty soon wears off, and they are happy to stay beneath the sea. However, this is not the case for the youngest sister, for she has a reason to want to continue to journey to the surface because she's fallen in love. When she finally tells her sisters, it is they who find out where the prince is living so that the Little Mermaid can watch him from afar. It is her sisters who keep her company when she decides to sell her voice so that she can meet her prince in the hope that he falls in love with her, visiting her each night. And when it's clear that that gamble has failed to pay off and the prince is about to marry someone else, it is her sisters who sell their hair to the sea witch, always a bit of a problematic character in children's fairy tales, to offer her a way out, a knife with which to kill the prince. The mermaid refuses, and the story ends with her throwing herself back into the sea, only to find herself cast into a 300-year purgatory as a daughter of the air. As Lady Hale alluded to, just over 20 years ago, when women in the senior judiciary were outnumbered about 17 to 1, I wrote an article in which I suggested an analogy between the Little Mermaid and the woman judge. Like the Little Mermaid, I argued that the woman judge was an outsider and that to fit in, she too had to give up what made her distinctive. And over the years, the image of the woman judge as the Little Mermaid has caught and continues to catch the imagination. Most recently in Carrie Young, who works at UCL, her video exhibition on women judges called Appearance. 20 years on, the story of the woman judge has moved on. There are now many more examples of women judges who are emphatically not the Little Mermaid, or at least the voice-selling, self-denying version found in Andersen's tale. Not least Lady Hale, who has consistently repeated her determination not to be like the Little Mermaid. But understandings of the judge and judging have developed too, in large part because of women's presence in and impact on the judiciary and adjudication. Women and other non-traditional judges are not only able but willing to speak in a multiplicity of voices, and happily so. My thinking about the Little Mermaid and her story have also moved on. Published the year Queen Victoria ascended the throne, The Little Mermaid is at its heart a story about sisters and sisterhood. It is a coming-of-age tale about the relationship and distance between two worlds where neither fully understands the other. Were I to write my paper today, I would focus on all Andersen's sea princesses, the Little Mermaid, but also her sisters and grandmothers. And vitally, I'd start not with the silence of the Little Mermaid, but with the distinctiveness of the mermaid's voices, individual, otherworldly, yet sadly unintelligible to the sailors. And I'd suggest that this, too often, has been the fate of women judges. It is not that they have sold their distinctive voices, but that too often they have inhabited a world where, in the words of Lady Hale, their male colleagues meant well, but simply didn't know what to do with them. And I would point out that, like the pretty little children in Hans Andersen's tale who can swim in the water even though they don't have fishtails, the sailors and the mermaids have much more in common than we might think. And I would point out that while each woman judge, like the Little Mermaid, may have her distinct voice, that this is no less true of everybody else, that we are all distinctive. Like all the characters in Andersen's tale, we are all shaped by our experiences and backgrounds, and that all judges, whatever their gender, bring their distinctive voices and insights to their judging. And these are informed, at least in part, by who they are, where they've visited, what they've seen, who they've talked with, as well as their intersecting identity characteristics. And I would point out that the judicial product is better for it. I'd go on to warn against focusing on individual heroines, mermaid or human, fictional or otherwise. I'd suggest that allowing our heroines to be seen as lone voices instead of representatives of a mass movement of people who are exceptional or personally courageous, rather than carried along by a host of supporters, is to fall into the trap history has set for us. And I would write about how reducing the struggle for justice to the success or failure of an individual's effort risks discouraging later generations from forming alliances which may more effectively change the status quo, as well as creating a lightning rod for our disappointments. And I would point out that, like Andersen's mermaids, women judges rarely, if ever, act alone, even when they're the only woman on a given bench. I'd explore the unity in community. I would write about how from the outset, women judges have relied on and worked together within networks of families, friends, and political allies. How for every Rose Helleborn, Nina Lowry, Lady Hale, there are many others who are less familiar or not even known at all. Women who came at the same time, or too early, or too late. And I would write about how women's progress to the bench followed decades of resistance, of small steps forward and bigger steps backwards. And I'd write about how hard-won games are easily lost as momentum and focus shift elsewhere, and how advances were often followed by backlash as men attempted to reassert the control they formerly enjoyed. And I'd write about how this isn't unique to the law, but is mirrored in many walks of life. And I'd argue that for these reasons, the endeavour of feminist legal history is more important than ever. And in doing so, I would imagine the grandmother's story. I would tell about how she came to know so much about the lands above the sea. And in doing, I try and make clear the importance of acknowledging and celebrating the many women and feminists who we stand alongside and on whose shoulders we stand. This is their story. Judicial diversity is a priority without priority. Over the last decade, judicial appointments and diversity more generally have slipped down successive UK governments' agendas, whilst those with the levers to effect change appear to have surrendered, in practice, if not in rhetoric, to the glacially slow pace of progress. And while successive Lord Chancellors and Lord Chief Justices now know better than to make predictions, the messaging for well over 2 decades now has been largely optimistic. Change is coming, we are told, not as fast as we might like, but coming nonetheless. And in the interim, gains are lost. The appointments of Lord Richards and Lord Lloyd Jones to the UK Supreme Court in August 2022 and the lone presence of Lady Rose highlight not only how far we have fallen from the giddy heights of 2018 to 2020, but also, and we consistently see this in feminist law campaigns, how easily hard-fought gains slip away. And that's where gains have been made. This is not always the case. Barring any unexpected retirements, we won't see a justice from a minoritized ethnic background appointed to the Supreme Court for at least another 3 years, by which time there will have been 33 appointments and the Supreme Court will have been operational for the best part of 2 decades. And even if this landmark is reached, and there's no guarantee that it will, the diverse representation on the Supreme Court will still be somewhat short of the reasonable target set by Justice in 2017 of at least 2 white non-justices and a maximum of 7 white men by 2026. At the same time, there's a danger that debates about what to do about diversity and why it's important have gone stale, stymied by a mix of familiarity and neglect. Moreover, reigniting conversations about judicial diversity in the current climate might seem somewhat misplaced, given in the deepening crisis across the criminal justice system and the justice system more broadly in England and Wales. However, it's beginning to seem like judicial diversity might be back on the agenda. Not that it ever really went away. Since 2006, when the JSC started its work, there's been just under 30 parliamentary, official, judicial, third sector reports addressing the ongoing concerns about the lack of representation in the judiciary and/or offering options for reform. However, growing and sustained evidence of discrimination within the appointments process has given rise to a renewed sense of urgency. While there continues to be improvement in relation to the appointment of women judges, progress in relation to candidates from a minoritised ethnic background has stagnated. According to Ministry of Justice statistics, in 2022, black judges make up just 1% of the judiciary, a proportion which has remained unchanged since 2014. For many, the fault lies with the appointments process overseen and run by the Judicial Appointments Commission, a product of New Labour's constitutional reforms, though the idea of an appointments committee was first mooted by Justice back in 1972. The JAC has spent much of its existence under siege, unable and perhaps at times unwilling to make use of the limited levers it has to secure effective change. And in recent years, there have been very repeated calls for varying levels of reform from Justice, the leaders of the Bar Council and Law Society, parliamentarians and academics. Political pressure is growing too. Over the last 3 years, judicial diversity has been raised in Parliament in various forms 37 times, compared to just 8 times the 2 years prior to this. Of course, we've been here before. We can hear echoes of the Law Society's 1999 boycott of secret soundings in I. Stephanie Boyce's call last year for the abolition of statutory consultation. We can recognise elements of the Hansard Society's 1990 Women on the Top report in Baroness Chakrabarty's call for time-limited affirmative action in 2021. We can see Helena Kennedy's criticism of the potential for cloning in the pre-2006 appointment system, mirrored in the unattributed description reported in the Times last year of the JAC as a judicial sausage factory, churning out identical judges generation after generation, and who help to ensure that others in their own image are appointed. At other times, the familiarity chastens. Compare, for example, Labour MP Brian Sedgemore's criticism back in 1989 of the institutional racism within the judiciary, with the findings of the hugely important Monteith report on racial bias in the bench, published in October last year. In the intervening 33 years, black representation in the senior judiciary remains the same, 0, a figure which belies wicked tales of progress. However, in so doing, we risk presenting ourselves as stuck in some Sisyphean, I'm so glad, did I say that right? I've been practicing it, nightmare, destined to repeat the same cycle of reports, dismay, reform and regress. And this is unfortunate because, not least to the best of my knowledge, Sisyphus was the bad guy, hence the thing with the boulder. And so it robs us of our agency and suggests that there's something natural and inevitable about the mountain we have to climb in order to achieve equity or parity, rather than it being the result of decades of privilege and discrimination. So it's time to reset the narrative, to return to and remake the arguments for judicial diversity. The arguments for judicial diversity, usually coalescing around the big three, equity, legitimacy and quality, have been notably absent and from recent policy discussions. When they are mentioned, usually in the opening paragraph of 1 or 2 sentences, the focus has been almost exclusively on the arguments of equity of opportunity and legitimacy and public confidence. And in fact, it's been this way for some time. And understandably so. After all, the argument for diversity has been won. We all agreed that a diverse judiciary, all things being equal, of course, is a good, maybe even a very good thing. Well, perhaps. However, beneath the veneer of agreement, there continues to be substantial disagreement about almost everything else, including how we might get a diverse judiciary, how long it should take, what it might look like, and why we wanted it in the first place. And it's this final point, disagreement over the arguments of the diversity, that matters. It matters because some strong arguments are stronger than others. Some have greater purchase with different audiences than others. And it matters because in the end, the arguments for judicial diversity take us in different directions. Indeed, one of the consequences of the focus on the appointment system, on how judges are appointed since the late 1990s, is a similar focus on equity and legitimacy arguments. The quality argument is different. It focuses not on how individuals access the institution or the status or legitimacy of the institution itself, but on the judicial output, on what judges might do once they get there. And we can see this. And we can see an example of this in Helena Normanton's argument, writing in the Daily Mail in 1937, under the headline, "Women Judges Now." She asks why Great Britain continues to so callously ignore the latent and patent talent of her legally trained women, pointing to the presence of women judges across Europe and the US and China. Going on to answer her own question as to the difference women judges would make, she continues, "There are a whole field of legal remedies in which the knowledge of a woman's life would be particularly valuable, where women judges would bring a wider variegation of personality which interprets the law and applies its remedies and penalties to suit the persons before them." And she was not alone. Sir Alfred Davis MP, who had practiced as a solicitor in Liverpool, had reportedly raised the absence of women judges in Parliament as far back as 1922. Articles asking why not women judges and making the case for their appointments appeared relatively frequently in the press throughout the 19s and 20s. Jumping forward, that was an extra bit that I added yesterday. Jumping forward almost 100 years, arguments for diversity, that is, quality arguments for diversity, that is, that diversity improves the quality of the judicial output, that judicial diversity makes for better judging, have been largely absent and underplayed in political and policy debates since about the mid-1990s. The Fawcett Society's report on women and the criminal justice system, published in 2004, and Geoffrey Bindman and Karen Monaghan's Accelerating Diversity report from 2014, and many of the speeches of Lady Hale are notable exceptions. But by the late 1990s, quality arguments had been rebranded and truncated as difference arguments, and as a result had begun to fall out of favour. But the shift from quality to difference was more than semantic. In the process, the argument's vital second stage, that women judges' distinctive experience and insights improve the quality of the judicial output, gave way to an almost exclusive focus on the existence and composition of women judges' difference. A focus that former US Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 1991 rightly rejected as dangerous and unanswerable. Lady Hale, speaking in 2001, was also more than a little sceptical of arguments grounded in women judges' difference. It was an argument that, to use Kate Mallison's words, was theoretically weak, empirically questionable, and strategically dangerous. And she was right. Difference won't do. But quality will. Quality does. Unlike difference-based arguments which stall at the point of identifying difference, the quality argument impels change. It demands something is done. It requires the judiciary to be diverse. For once we accept who the judges are, and once we accept... it's my line and I got it wrong. I'll say it again. Once we accept who the judges matters, and this is relatively uncontroversial, it matters who our judges are. And in fact, by 2014, in truth, it was before this, but this was the best quote, Lady Hale agreed, making the argument for what she calls the business case for diversity. She continued that diverse courts are better courts, and that she too used to be sceptical about the argument that women judges were bound to make a difference, but I have come to agree with those great women judges who think that sometimes, on occasions, we may. And of course, Hale and others' point isn't exclusively tied to gender. The argument is this: the inclusion of judges from different backgrounds and with different identity characteristics impacts positively on the quality of a judiciary's decision-making. To use US former Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo's words, writing in 1921, out of the attrition of diverse minds, there is beaten something which has a constancy and uniformity and average value greater than its component elements. The judiciary is stronger, the justice dispensed better, the more diverse its decision makers. And on this view, a diverse bench is not merely tangential to good judging, but essential. Merit and diversity go hand in hand. In other words, if we want the judiciary to be the best it can be, quality matters. Not at some point in the future when the stars align, but right now. What's more, the quality argument works. Which brings me to the 10th of November, 1919. It's just after 7 p.m. Around 194 MPs, just over a quarter of the House, are present for the second reading of the coalition Liberal Conservative government's Industrial Court Bill in the House of Commons. Arising out of a recommendation of the Whitley Committee, the Industrial Courts Bill sought, among other things, to establish an industrial court, the purpose of which, in the words of Sir Robert Horne, Minister for Labour introducing the bill, was to establish a nucleus of permanent judges with the experience and ability to bring a judicial mind to bear on and to provide voluntary arbitration in trade disputes. The intention was to build on the success of two earlier ad hoc industrial arbitration bodies. And there was a strong desire on all sides to continue with established practice and personnel, reflected in the fact that 6 of the 14 first appointments to the Industrial Court, including its president, Sir William Mackenzie, had served on one or both of the earlier bodies. So too had Lucy Dean Streatfeild, a well-known figure who was one of the first women factory inspectors, overseeing 4,000 workshops in West London and a member of various trade boards. She would later become one of the first women magistrates. However, despite women having been members of the forerunners to the Industrial Court, there was no specific mention of women in the original bill. Now, one reason for this may have been that by this time, women's presence had become so integral to the operation of the court that their inclusion was self-evident and did not need special demarcation. Their presence was not only assumed, but assured. Or maybe, as was argued during the course of the debates by the then Solicitor General Sir Ernest Pollock MP, the soon-to-be enacted Sex Disqualification Removal Act 1919 would render any such vision superfluous. And certainly there was nothing in the course of the parliamentary debates to suggest that the court would not, where appropriate, positively welcome women's knowledge and experience in its deliberations. But nor was there anything to ensure when this would be the case, or importantly, to secure their equal footing around the table when they did join. Enter Alexander Shaw, member of the Scottish Liberal Party. He introduces an amendment requiring the presence of one or more women on the court on the basis of his experience working alongside women as chairman of an arbitration tribunal. He was unable to imagine, he argued, a court or tribunal dealing efficiently with cases in which women are concerned without the experience and guidance of women. He later remarked that the inclusion of the judgments of women on the court would strengthen the court and add weight to its decisions. In other words, if the court was to do its job well, if it was to be the best it could possibly be, then women needed to be involved in its decision-making. The quality of the court depended on their women's inclusion. Members from both sides spoke in favour of the amendment. Major Jack Hills MP, Conservative MP for Durham City, argued that there was a tremendous case for the inclusion of women in order to harness the expertise they had gained through their participation in adjudication of industrial disputes both during and since the war. Women's representation on the court, Hills continued, was vital to women's interests, their distinctive insights making them best placed to advise on women's cases, of which there were likely to be a considerable number. William Graham MP, a member of the Labour Party, went further, advocating for the inclusion of women on all cases and stating that there was no industrial dispute affecting men in which women were not directly or indirectly interested also. Others deployed what we might now call equity or legitimacy arguments for women's inclusion. Echoing contemporary claims made by the Women's Freedom League in their arguments for women lawyers and magistrates, Arthur Henderson MP, who's former chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, pointed to the necessity of including women members to ensure the legitimacy of and confidence in the court itself. Women's inclusion, Henderson suggested, was a matter of high principle and great practical importance and should be included in the very first clause of the bill. It's not quite fair, he continued, to leave all the cases affecting women to be arbitrated on by a court upon which there's no woman representative. And Shaw made a similar point. After all, this was the first election in which some women had been able to vote. And so he seriously doubted whether women would really trust a tribunal without an element of experience which women can give, or feel that they had been fairly treated. However, despite general agreement as to the value and necessity of women's presence on the court, Shaw's amendment was resisted by the Minister of Labour. Sir Robert Horne argued that the membership of the court was simply too small to guarantee a place for a woman member. Rather, he proposed that women be co-opted onto the court as necessary, as assessors on an ad hoc basis. After all, as he pointed out, there was nothing in the bill at present which in any way excluded the appointment of women or makes it incompetent to appoint them. Nevertheless, perhaps even he realised, to use the words of a journalist from the Manchester Guardian, which had been following the progress of the bill closely, even he realised this concession to women was not enough, and he also committed to giving the issue further consideration before report stage. Shaw was not convinced, perhaps because he knew that the argument for winning the argument for women's ad hoc representation was not enough. Political sympathies, promises and compromises were all very well, but without an explicit statutory provision ensuring women's presence on the courts, there were no guarantees it would happen. He pushed for a vote, where the amendment failed by 23 votes. But then, in a twist worthy of the traitors, just 8 days later, the minister changed his mind. On the 18th of November, he returned to the chamber with an amendment ensuring the presence of one or more women on the court with the, quotes, the prestige of full membership. It's not clear how this happened, though I wonder if he felt he'd been outmanoeuvred by Shaw. When introducing his amendment, Horne remarked on his disappointment with Shaw's decision to push the matter to a vote the previous week, and Shaw's response was conciliatory. The amendment was agreed to without debate, and women's participation on an equal footing, albeit not in equal numbers, with their male colleagues was embedded into the constitution of the court. 2 days later, on the 20th of November, the Industrial Courts Act received its royal assent. So this is a drawing of the Industrial Court, which was drawn by Dorothy Mackenzie, who was the niece of William Mackenzie, the first president of the court. The court sat sitting in Old Palace Yard in Westminster. The Industrial Court, now I realise I've written 13 here, but I said 14 earlier on, so that's something that I'll clarify when I get back to the draft. But there were 13 or 14 members. Of these, 4, including the president, were designated independent persons. The others either representing employers or workmen. And there were also 2 women members, Miss Violet Markham and Miss Cecile Matheson. Both were well known. Cecile Matheson was an author and warden of Birmingham's Women's Settlement and a prominent member of the National Union of Women Workers, the International Council of Women, and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. She had worked with confectionery manufacturer Edward Cadbury and Labour Party member and academic George Shawn on a large-scale research project on women's work and wages involving almost 6,500 interviews. Violet Markham had worked alongside Lucy Dean Streatfeild and others on the campaigns to improve working conditions of the so-called sweated trades. She'd also acted as deputy and later as director of the women's section of the short-lived National Service Department set up by Neville Chamberlain in 1916, where, Rose Mioch-Moody suggests, she most likely oversaw the appointment as Commissioner for the West Midlands Division of Miss Bebb, of Bebb and Law Society fame. Described by Lady Stocks as the best feminist I've ever known, Markham was perhaps best known primarily for her work as a leader of the anti-suffrage campaign, though she later switched sides. And she was also a staunch imperialist, though her ODMB entry suggests that over time her views on the empire evolved under the influence of Canadian politician Mackenzie King. Now, of course, we have to be careful with comparisons here. The Industrial Court was not a court of law. The judge's role on the Industrial Courts were closer to that of an arbitrator. And nor was women's presence in these types of roles unusual. By 1919, middle-class women had been performing quasi-legal judicial roles in public and civil life as local government councillors, factory inspectors and poor law guardians for some time. And of course, within weeks, by virtue of the more familiar 1919 Act, the Sex Disqualification Removal Act 1919, the names of the first 7 women magistrates would be announced, and Ada Summers would have become, on New Year's Eve 1919, the first woman to preside in a magistrate's court. Nevertheless, there are a few points we might draw out that are relevant to the current diversity debates. First, the importance of political will and leadership. Without the leadership of Alexander Shaw in proposing the amendment and leading the debate, the commitment of leading figures from both sides of the political divide in supporting it, and Sir Robert Horne's willingness to reflect and respond to the points raised, the outcome would likely have been very different. Of course, we can't know for sure, but it seems doubtful whether, but for their involvement, permanent appointments would have been made, let alone a statutory guarantee ensuring women's presence as equal members of the court. Second point is about the importance of context and feminist campaigns and networks. The Industrial Courts Bill was debated and passed in a little under 2 weeks. So there was little time for lobbying on the specifics of the bill, but this didn't seem to matter, perhaps because the arguments were already out there. Representation on the industrial court was seen and understood as an extension or application of wider arguments and campaigns for women's political representation in equal citizenship, of arguments made in other contexts. It was part of a broader picture and movement. So many, maybe even all, of the MPs present would have been familiar, though of course not necessarily supportive of, arguments for equal citizenship, including those grounded in women's special skills made during the long and protracted claims for franchise reform. Martin Pugh estimates that 2/3 of candidates in the 1918 general election had specifically addressed women voters in their promotional literature in order to actively court women voters. And of course, these arguments were still ongoing. Equal rights were not won in 1918. And in any event, as Anne Logan points out in her study of early women magistrates, political rights were only one aspect of equal citizenship, which also included civil and social rights and duties. For women's suffrage campaigners, Logan writes, the vote was not an end of itself, but rather a means to an end. In the words of Mrs. Fawcett, what they were trying to achieve was the achievement of a nobler and truer relationship between the sexes. Also, some of those involved in the debates were lawyers and or involved in national and international campaigns for women's representation in the legal profession and beyond. Alexander Shaw was a lawyer and also the son of Lord Thomas Shaw, who was a member of the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. And Shaw Senior, at the time of the Industrial Courts Act, was rendering valuable assistance in the formation of the League of Nations, Article 7 of which states that its secretariat, in effect the International Civil Service, would be open to both men and women. Jack Hills, another participant in the debate, was a former solicitor. Described by Violet Markham in her autobiography as a close ally, he was a former anti-suffragist who, by 1919, had become a champion of the women's cause. At the time of the Industrial Courts Act, as Ozia Muti notes in her wonderful article on Miss Bebb, Hills was also playing a pivotal role in the campaigns for women to enter the legal professions. He had supported and or introduced legislation to this effect on a number of occasions in the preceding years, and chaired a banquet at the House of Commons to celebrate the admission of women to the legal profession in 1920. Robert Horne, the Minister for Labour, who caught my eye as a daughter of a manse, was a son of a manse, another one to add to my list alongside Gordon Brown and David Tennant. He was a barrister and a KC, and according to his ODMB entry, he was the inspiration for the 1923 rhyme, Beaming Bert, that incorrigible flirt, who loved to dance at the balls in London's noble marble halls. He was a favourite with political hostesses, which suggests that there may well have been some social encounters and conversations with women involved in these campaigns. And his involvement with women in quasi-judicial capacity didn't end with the Industrial Court. He went on to oversee the passing of the Underemployment Insurance Act in 1920, the administration of which provided additional income for a number of the early women barristers, including Helena Normanton and Monica Geekie-Cobb. Third point, quotas work. They get the job done. But of course we know this. We see it every time a justice from Northern Ireland or Scotland retires from the Supreme Court. But there's a broader point here. There's another reason why carving the requirement of representation into the text of the law is important, one that recognises the fragility of success, particularly in the context of feminist law reform, and understands the strategic benefit of embedding a positive requirement of women's presence, or indeed representation more broadly, in the DNA of a body as a means of insulating it from the vagaries of politics and shifts in personnel. For there's a familiar sting in the tail of women's representation on the industrial court. By the time the first president of the Industrial Court, Sir William Mackenzie, by this time Lord Almery, came to publish his account of the early years on the court in 1927, the recognition of the value of women's special skills had begun to wane. Lord Almery noticing in passing that although it was apparently thought in 1919 that women's point of view was something separate and distinct which required special representation, that contention would not go unchallenged now. 50 years later, this view had hardened. By the time the composition of the Industrial Court came before Parliament again in 1971, the spectre of appointment on merit, understood as attached exclusively to an individual, had entered the political fray, and the so-called statutory woman was one of its first casualties. The provision that Shaw and others had successfully argued for in the early decades of the century was comprehensively rejected. And amendments along the exact lines of Shaw's from 1919 was initially posed by Lord Diamond and supported by Lord Janner, but was withdrawn by Lord Diamond as he changed his mind during the debates. Although none of the arguments were against quotas per se, as there continued to be a statutory requirement, quota perhaps, of lay employer and employee representation on the court. The arguments against the proposal will be familiar. Far from underpinning the Industrial Court's integrity and the ability of the court to do the best possible job, the statutory requirement of representation was recast, in the words of Lord Conesford, a long-time opponent of such measures, as insulting to women. Though, charmer that he was, Lord Conesford was not averse to a compromise whereby the statutory woman would be joined in the interest of sex equality by a statutory man, to counter the clearly non-existent risk that the court would become all-female. The arguments had moved away from a focus on the value of women's experience and expertise to the quality of the court's reasoning and decision-making, to a familiar focus on the appointments process and equality of opportunity, on women's ability to join a given institution. Opposition to the measure was not, it was argued, the result of any hostility towards women's continued presence on the course, nor was it to disregard their particular knowledge or expertise as being of considerable benefit, but no longer essential, to its deliberations. Rather, in the words of Baroness Emmett, who herself had been a statutory woman, it was simply unnecessary. Women didn't need it. As Lord Hailsham suggested, it was a relic of the past, redundant in modern times. The difficulty was that in the early 1970s, there were just 4 women on the High Court and Circuit Bench combined, representing just over 1% of the judiciary overall. Then, as now, the old days were not quite as far behind as Lord Hailsham optimistically implies. So where does this leave us? Anchored in a commitment to disciplinary, social and political change, feminist legal history not only seeks to uncover new histories, but to challenge and ultimately transform our understandings of the past and present, and indeed the future. The Industrial Court is a case in point. Of course, we'll never know exactly what happened during the Industrial Court's debates in November 1919, of conversations that were had in the lobby, or deals done elsewhere. Hansard and other public records can only tell us so much. But we do know that the quality argument for diversity was made. And we know that in contrast to the debates about judicial diversity today, the quality argument was a key part of the debate. Women's presence was explicitly and deliberately tied to the ability of the ability and the success, the quality or the merit, if you like, of the court. We know that quality did, that quality worked, that it worked to ensure women's formal inclusion. And we know that quality mattered. It mattered to Shaw and to others who spoke, and ultimately to those responsible for the formation of the court. The recognition of the value of diverse experience or expertise within the collective body provided a reason for women's inclusion as equal members. And we also know that, as a result, at a time when women were unable to formally practice law, and when prominent figures and institutions were arguing against the inclusion in the legal profession, women's inclusion in the legal profession and ability as lawyers, when at best the Sex Disqualification Removal Act would simply enable women to join the professions, the Industrial Courts Act positively required women's presence. At a time before women could become judges or magistrates, at a time when women's assumed bias was used as an argument against their appointment, the Industrial Courts Act provided statutory recognition and protection in the form of a statutory quota of women's ability as judges, of their ability, in the words of Labour MP J.R. Clines, as persons of experience, of known impartiality, judicially minded and capable of estimating evidence and reaching a reasonable decision according to the revealed facts of the case. And we know that, as a result, a quarter of a century before Sybil Campbell's appointment as the first female full-time judge, and almost half a century before Elizabeth Lane's groundbreaking appointment to the High Court, the Industrial Courts Act ensured the appointment of not just one, but two women to sit in the capacity of judges on the most senior industrial tribunal in the land. It would take just shy of 100 years for the UK Supreme Court to do the same, and just 2 years after that for it to slip away. For feminist legal history also teaches us that one success is rarely the end of the story. That, as we see, progress cannot be taken for granted and hard-won gains are easily lost as momentum and focus shift elsewhere. And it teaches us that arguments come in and out of fashion as intellectual trends shift. That arguments which carried the day at one point, arguments that remain good arguments today, can be lost sight of. But it also gives us a reason to continue to be talking about and making the case for judicial diversity. And it teaches us that the windows of opportunity may open only briefly, like the journeys of mermaids to the surface of the sea, offering a glimpse onto new worlds. But when they do, the story of the Little Mermaid's grandmother tells us that we need to be ready to grasp the opportunities, ready to make and remake the arguments, and to build on the commitment of those who have gone before. The end.
So let's hear it for the statutory woman. That is the best argument for quotas I have ever heard. And I've always been an opponent of quotas for all sorts of reasons, but I'm not sure that I now am. So thank you very much, Erica. Questions?
So thank you very much for this really interesting talk. I have two small questions. One, if you can maybe highlight some jurisdictions that have a different system that you think works well and maybe can be transplanted. So that's one question. The other question that I had was about the scope or the extent to which we can perhaps try and bridge the gap and bring the lived experience to the judiciary that exists now until we can reach a point where it is sufficiently representative to do that on its own.
He's calling those small questions. They're both of them very large questions. Well,
I think I might have a go at the first, and then I might ask you to use some of your insights on the second. So there are different ways of if you're talking about judicial appointments, which I think you were, there are different ways of appointing judges, and particularly over in continental Europe, there's people join the judiciary much earlier on in their career, as opposed to it being a second career as it is here. I'm not convinced that the transplantation of that is the way forward. I think there's much more that we can do with our current appointments processes and how it works, rather than sort of throwing it all up and starting again. Not least because what you find in continental Europe is the flip, that you have lots more women, or maybe other underrepresented groups gathered around in the lower echelons of the judiciary, but there's still the difficulty of them making their way up. So I think transplantation in that way might be hard, but there is an example of one of the things that I mentioned around political leadership, which happened in Canada, where the government took a very proactive approach to diversifying the judiciary and was able to do so through the leadership and making it a political necessity. And so I think that we have got examples of where the actions taken, as I'm using the example of Alexander Shaw, but actions, more recent examples where that leadership can affect results. It's a really interesting question about the lived experience. I think where I'd start answering that question is one of the points I was trying to make around that all judges have lived experiences. And one of the red herrings and dead ends that those arguing for judicial diversity towards the end of the late 90s got themselves into was focusing on the difference of the woman as opposed to thinking about how all judges are different. And so I think that there is a recognition that there is an element of who the judges matters across the board, albeit within the composition of the court as a whole. The diversity within that group is important. That said, I don't know, because I've looked at a couple of your judgments, Lady Hale, where you've talked about sort of being a grandmother or as a mother. Have any of your male judicial colleagues ever done something like that, where they've kind of recognised themselves in the judgments?
Oh, I don't know. I'm afraid my ability to talk about myself in my judgments is probably a bit self-referential, but sometimes, well, I did think it was important to talk about being a grandmother in this particular case, which was about duress and the defence of duress in the criminal law, and what would make me frightened and therefore make me do something that I really didn't want to do might be quite different from what would make a strong man feel frightened. And I thought it was important to introduce that because everybody was all about, let's have the objective, what would be a threat that would affect the objective, reasonable man, almost always is. And yet, of course, we are all different and different things will affect us. Now, one knows the arguments for objectivity in that context, but nevertheless, I thought it important to bring my personality into that. And so I have done that from time to time. And yes, I think one can. But the general point that we're all different does get reflected, does it not, in that there are feminist men and there are women who are definitely not feminists. And the quality is improved by having feminists as much as it is improved by having people with particular protected characteristics. Can I ask you something? Is that all right? Can I do that? One of the problems that we have is that we are not allowed to discriminate in recruitment on the basis that somebody has a protected characteristic. So it's arguably unlawful to say we would like to have a better gender balance on the Supreme Court and therefore we are going to recruit a woman when we have a vacancy. Now, obviously, it's got to be a woman of quality. We're not talking about recruiting somebody who isn't any good. And you can do the tie-breaking thing if you've got people of equal merit. But you've still got this fundamental problem of our individually based recruitment laws, where we're talking about protected characteristics, that make it really difficult to have the whole idea of a statutory woman or a quota or whatever. Now, do you think we've got to amend the Equality Act in order to solve that problem?
Lady Hale, that's a really hard and long question. I would have prepped had I known about it. I don't. Well, the answer is that it is fundamental to my argument, and I was staying in 1919 as opposed to now. So I'm really sorry. I don't know the Equality Act or the law enough to do that. But I think my instinctive response is that we need to look at it because it's something, and I would return to the point that you've made about the Supreme Court around, we look to the Supreme Court about needing to have a representation across the jurisdictions of the UK. And so I think that there are ways in which, and we know that in Northern Ireland, there's a requirement of the JAC to look to ensure that the judiciary, the appointments they're making are representative. So I think that there are ways we can do it without amending the law, and I don't know where I am on amending the law, but I will put that to my to-do list and drop you a line and let you know where I go on.
I'm sorry for landing you with that.
No, that's fine. Obviously, it's one I should have prepped.
Well, it's the thought that occurred to me on your reading your otherwise very powerful argument. We've more or less got to the end of our time, but is there another question? Yes, there's a young woman here. Yes.
Sorry,
wait.
We had that's asked.
No, let's go for this one. Yes.
Okay.
No, I'm reading the room. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. My question stems from something Lady Hale mentioned. I think there's a conflict now when it comes to appointing people into the judiciary between merit and qualifications and diversity. So while there's nothing wrong in having a white male man from Oxbridge in our Supreme Court, there's again an argument of what about a colored woman from a city college? So that argument of merit eventually comes down to a university, which many people of diversity may not be able to afford. So where do you think today we stand when it comes to the JAC on distinguishing between merit and qualification and diversity? And is there a line that can be drawn?
I think one of the things that goes to the nub of your question is the difficulty and the danger in using proxies for merit as a way of determining merit, which is what you have described. So we could make an argument that appointment on merit is a good thing, so long as it truly is appointment on merit and not appointment on proxies for merit, which I think has too often been the case. And I think that one of the things that the quality argument shows us is that merit and diversity sort of go together, that when you're looking at who to appoint. A decade ago, Alan and Chris Patterson wrote a report called Guardian the Guardians, and in it they have an analogy of a football team. So don't press me on this because I'm not up on football teams, but they basically point to the fact that if you're putting a football team together, you need to have a balance of who's on the court. And I was thinking about this recently and thinking, say for example we could clone Messi. And we wouldn't have a football team of Messi's, even though he's purportedly, I don't know, it was just an example that somebody made. He's very good. And he's the best, yes. So I'm told, whatever the best means. But what I'm told is that you wouldn't put Messi in goal if you weren't going to put him anywhere else. And so what it is that it's the movement away, and what Alan and Chris Patterson were arguing for is a movement away from looking at merit in an individual context to looking at merit in the collective context. So I think there's two ways of coming at what you're saying. It's both not relying on proxies, but also understanding what we mean by merit.
It is no coincidence that we managed to up the female membership of the Supreme Court on those occasions where we were filling 3 vacancies at once. Because then you get away from the proxies and you get away from the that individual against that individual, and you can look at a range of people and think, well, everybody's got something to bring, and we can try and bring as many different sorts of people to the court as possible. It's much more difficult when you're just filling 1 vacancy, or has just been shown 2. But there we go. Now, would you like to ask your question, having been shut out of it by my ridiculous favouritism?
I fully support it. Thank you very much. That was both a sobering but also very inspiring talk, and I really appreciated it. I was thinking about business. Business seems to have less problem understanding that diverse groups lead to better results. And one question I have is the process of judicial decision making and the relationship of the process to the quality argument. if decisions are issued seriatim by individuals writing their own, his or her own view of the legal question, does that sort of reinforce this, the problem of viewing quality as a team? Do we need to think about processes of decision making that lead to single opinions or fewer dissents or some kind of actual structural mechanism within the design of judicial decision making and the output itself to highlight this benefit of diverse quality group decision making?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I'm going to start, and then you can come in and say. Well, I was going to think, Joy. Anyway, I'll come. So I think from your starting point, one of the things I first thought of when you were talking about businesses doing it better is I think it goes to one of the points I was trying to make around just it being an expectation, it being part of conversations, it being this is what should happen, and people understanding that and talking about that. Where I thought you were going with your question was around sort of judges deciding cases individually and writing judgments individually, and how then can you make claims for them in relation to the court. And for that, the response I might give would be around judges not working in isolation. They might hear a case in isolation, but they talk, and there's a discussion, and there's also a reading across of judgments, certainly between courts and so on. So I think that whilst I'm not suggesting that there's a great collaboration, I'm thinking in the lower courts, I think that there is some, and there could be more if we recognised that this was something that was important. Going from that to sort of altering how what judgments actually come out is an interesting question, which I don't think I haven't thought of, and my instinct as a reader of judgments and the common lawyer is that I love as many judgments as possible, and all the dissents are brilliant, and especially when looking at trying to find sort of people doing different things. But equally, I understand that view probably isn't justifiable very far in terms of legal decision making and clarity. So I think it's an interesting question I need to think more of. Brenda?
Well, both of those things. I mean, I would agree. Obviously, trial judging is done on an individual basis. But on the other hand, it's usually done in a building where there are other judges working. And in the olden days, of course, everybody used to have lunch together. And my observation is that they still tend so to do. It's just they have to bring their own sandwiches in rather than buy it from a caterer, which is a great shame, very short-sighted. But that practice of being together and obviously talking about cases and getting a range of views round the table does assist in a more collaborative approach to things, which is the point you're getting at, and a bit of being able to think outside the box, which again is what diversity happens in business and so on. When it comes to collegiate courts, like the Court of Appeal, problem with the way the Court of Appeal works, at least its civil division, and in fact criminal even more so, when I was in the Court of Appeal, was that the person who is expected to do the lead judgment has been identified in advance. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that people don't collaborate on it, and of course it can change and so on and so forth, but it is a bit of an excuse for not paying quite as much attention as you would if it wasn't clear. Whereas in the Supreme Court, the judgment writer is not identified in advance. It only emerges after a collaborative discussion as to what the answer might be. And although we might end up with a remarkable degree of agreement and single judgments wherever possible with a view to clarity rather than pleasing the academics, it has been usually a collaborative effort to produce that judgment, because different views get fed into it. So that's all part of the argument for quality. Diversity equals quality. There we are. That's your message. Thank you very much, Erica. It's been absolutely brilliant and really wonderful. And it just shows the value of looking into the past and the arguments that there were in the past and how they can inform today, as well as everything else about it. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.